On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Kleberg Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. On Story is also brought to you in part by the Bogle Family Vineyards, 6th-generation farmers and 3rd-generation winemakers based in Clarksburg, California. Makers of sustainably grown wines that are a reflection of their family values since 1968. From Austin Film Festival, this is On Story, a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers, creators, and filmmakers. This week on Story, Lawman Bass Reeves co-creator Chad Feehan and series directors Christina Alexandria Voros and Damian Marcano join us to discuss the revival of the television Western.
Growing up in the Caribbean, we don't make the media. We only import it. So growing up, I used to watch The Lone Ranger. I used to watch a lot of Westerns. You know, I come from a place that if you went to see Star Wars, I think the double feature was a Western. And it was just this black and white, pointless movie that we watched, and we would all sit and be cowboys in the theater and start play shooting at each other. But I have also a very open mind because we weren't necessarily trying to make the Western. I was watching with my grandfather. You know, we were trying to make something current.
How did this actually occur from the recognition of the story and going to try to pitch it and get it done and get it out there?
David Oyelowo has been trying to make this project since 2014. And somewhere along the lines, he brought the project to David Glasser and Taylor Sheridan, who then turned around and sold it to Paramount Plus. And Taylor recommended me to David as a writer. I grew up in Fort Worth and had heard stories about bass as a child, and those stories took root in my consciousness. And then David Oyelowo invited me to dinner. And over the course of a 4-hour dinner, not only did I make a lifelong friend, but I learned a lot of things about bass that I didn't know, about the nooks and crannies of his life that aren't regularly reported. I learned about where the myth of the man both converged with and separated from reality. And I quickly became obsessed. I consumed any information that I could find, opened a writer's room, wrote the pilot, and they greenlit the show off the pilot.
So let's talk about the pilot, that you establishing this world and how you all decided what that pilot's going to be and what part of the story that you were going to focus on as the launch for him and how you were setting things up for the rest of the season.
Doing the research and learning that Bass was forced to accompany George Reeves into the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, learning that he was at the Battle of Pea Ridge, learning that he escaped enslavement over a dispute around a card game with George, and then learning that he was a runaway with the American Indians in Indian Territory. For me, that was one of the most exciting incidents that I've ever heard of for a character.
Brave men of the 11th! Get together, goddamn! There's not to make me blind! There's not the reason why! There's but to do and die! You will follow me, and you will fire.
And so immediately knew that, you know, we wanted to start the narrative there. And Sydney had written two historical fiction novels out of a set of 3. And in the first one, really captured a lot of those incidents in a beautiful way. And so optioned Sydney's work and then adapted it from there.
And who directed the pilot?
I did.
So the card game, there were a couple of really like wow moments in this.
Ooh, that was a close one. Yeah, you don't play poker like I taught you to shoot them Yankees, but that was a good game.
Unless I had a queen. That there Queen of Hearts.
You think you did what?
I played a Queen of Hearts. I had it.
Oh, there's only one Queen of Hearts in this deck. I had it. You saw it. Do you understand? And you must not know what a queen looks like.
You cheated me.
Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but singleness of heart, fearing God.
A false balance is abomination to the Lord.
But a just silence your tongue, boy!
It was a kind of a shocker and a very emotional scene, and you know, it's obviously part of the lore of the story. And I'd just like to hear how you decided how y'all were going to essentially set that up. And George Reeves' character.
This pilot was my first pilot as a director. And when you read through a script such as this one that opens with various Civil War battles and then has these like diamond-like scenes that are so compact with drama and nuance of character, it's a little intimidating. You know, being tasked with shooting the Civil War in 4 days is the kind of thing that can keep you up at night. To be tasked with that card game scene with two actors who were less in themselves as artists would have been a very different experience. When you have people who are as remarkably talented as David O. and Shea Wiggum, you kind of get to sit back and slightly nudge this way or slightly nudge that way, but so much is coming from the research they've done, the deep process that they've been through to get themselves to that point. I think we were all incredibly nervous just because it's such a pivotal moment in the script, and it needed to be as it was on the page, and it was. I think what both David and Shea brought to that scene is nothing short of 1,000% of themselves as artists.
Usually, you know, when you're making fiction, you're trying to get the actor to react to the character that has been created on the page. But in this particular case, you have this extra layer of you all having to ensure that the historical fact is represented in addition to that character on the page, right? To making sure that something in here isn't going to be, you know, somehow misunderstood or misrepresented once it goes from the page to that.
You know, so my way is always trying to have that human discussion before we go into a scene, because I was always the person that fell asleep on the history lesson. All right, I probably failed every history class I ever took. And, you know, I didn't take this job because of the historical reverence. I come from a different place, right? I'm a man from a rock in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. But I got here and I started realizing how important this story was to everyone. So yeah, the historical truth of it is very important. But I also believe they were able to write something that without me knowing any of this history, I connected to as a human being. So therefore, that matched my process. And I think that's how I at least attacked each scene that we did, because I didn't feel like we were shooting history from the wide lens, saying, oh, okay, some bad stuff happened to this group of people and it was done by this group of people. We actually went in with the close lens, and it was about what happened to this man and what happened to this family. And guess what? I'm a man with a family, so I kind of understand that.
I've been doing Westerns for a couple of years now, and I think to your initial sort of query about doing historical pieces, period pieces, I think one of the things that is a real like deal breaker in their success is their accuracy. But if someone goes, that's not a period saddle, or they didn't have those light fixtures then, or that location doesn't look, you know, accurate to the way roads were made, you know, that kind of thing can immediately pull someone out of the story. And there are so many of those details that can pull someone out of the story that it's really, not only did we feel safe because we had the incredible work done by the writing team, but every department head brought it and made us feel protected as directors, that there wasn't going to be a textile that was wrong. And when you don't have to worry about that, you really get to focus on performance.
When we started talking about doing this panel, I just went to Google, which is what everybody does, right? But there's very little on Google here when you consider how big a piece of history this should be. What is lore and what is actual fact, and where you found that. That must have been a big part of what your production team is worrying about and what your writer's room looks like, is like, how do we identify what's true?
First step was to hire an expert, and that man is named Sidney Thompson. And Sidney spent, I believe, a decade of his life researching Bass. And from there, there are these sort of seminal moments in Bass's life that we do know. And we use those as pillars to lay the foundation of the narrative. And there's a lot of gaps in the history of Bass Reeves. And so in order to fill in those gaps, we were driven by the thematics that we wanted to explore. With the Seminoles and Black Seminoles more specifically, it was a part of history I didn't really know that much about, and became obsessed with it. So said, okay, we believe that Bass likely hid with the Seminoles because the Seminoles were most receptive to, people with black skin.
Seminole?
Run away.
And, the Seminoles and people who escaped enslavement lived together. And so that's how we landed on that particular storyline in the pilot. In the show, you'll see some of the famous stories that are all over Google. You'll see some of the lesser-known stories that Sidney and a few other sources turned us on to. And then you'll see, a fair share of fictional stories that fill in the in-between.
His family's a big part of this, and he was married to the same woman for a long time, right? I mean, until she died, right? So let's talk about how she's woven into your show.
Initially, the concept of Bass having to leave his family for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks at a time was something that I identified with, and something that I wanted to infuse in the narrative about the cost of career on a marriage, the cost of a career on a family, the cost of traveling like that on your own personal psyche. And so that's sort of where it started. And then I felt like there was a huge deficiency in this genre of women with agency and self-purpose. And so really wanted to honor the women that have influenced my life so greatly with the character of Jenny.
It is the most perfect example of behind every great man is potentially a greater woman, right? And Jenny is that. Jenny is his rock that the work takes him further and further away from. And so you have her side of that as well. And in order for his family, that is the most important thing to him, to thrive, she has to be as steadfast and strong.
Bass? Are you hurt?
I done messed up. For all of us.
Oh, Lord. Bass, look at me. Look, you gonna run now. You gonna take a horse, and you gonna run far from here, far from all this. This, you are. I ain't watching you get strung up and dead. I ain't. So you gonna run. You gonna run and never look back. Promise me. I'm your woman, do what I say, promise me.
talked to David about the fact that every time Bass left home, and this is something that I think is even current for those of us who have to live our lives on the road. You know, I'm here in Texas talking to you guys today, all for my family, right? For the show as well, but really, I think we're each doing this for our family. And there's a weird little thing that happens, which is that you expect your family to be exactly the same way that you left them when you return home. And imagine what that was like in the 1800s. So you're out on the road, you're fighting this, you're doing this on behalf of a badge that may or may not respect your emancipation in this country, and you're still wondering what is going on with my family back home. Lauren E. Banks is definitely a name to remember. And I think the most amazing thing about the character, as we talk about him wanting his family to be the same, she was such a tough human being that she only got tougher the longer he stayed away. And reading it, sometimes I didn't understand it, but then when I would see her perform it and I would see us go after the truth and how she felt in the moment, it was just brilliant. We realized that it was her at home with all these kids. She took care of the livestock. She took care of the land. She was pretty much mother and father while he was gone.
You don't need to look any farther to frame women who lived 200 years ago in the West than by looking at women now who live in the West. You look at women who are ranchers or horsewomen or work in agriculture, and you see how strong they are, and then you extrapolate and go, well, if you have to be that strong to do it now, how strong did you have to be to do it back then? There isn't a lot of historical documentation of what their inner thought process was. And then you imagine that without electricity or internet or grocery stores. And it gives you a little bit of room to make these women as strong as you want them to be, because the reality is they were probably stronger than that.
Coming from the Caribbean and not having grown up with, I mean, every culture has its historical specifics, and certainly Westerns are American. So how do you approach that? Because it does feel like it's something that you'd have to kind of absorb yourself in for a little while.
Growing up in the Caribbean, we don't make anything. We don't make the media. We only import it. So growing up, I used to watch The Lone Ranger. I used to watch a lot of Westerns. You know, I come from a place that if you went to see Star Wars, I remember when I went to see Star Wars, I think the double feature was a Western. And it was just this black and white, pointless movie that we watched, and we would all sit and be cowboys in the theater and start play shooting at each other. But I have also a very open mind, because we weren't necessarily trying to make the Western. I was watching with my grandfather. You know, we were trying to make something current, and I think this beautiful state just every day lent a 360-degree view of, yeah, we could really make something special.
This is very much a Western of a time period. You know, you're having to capture the landscape in this to some degree as a character in your story. So how are you all approaching that from the production and direction perspective?
I learned about the state of Texas is the best way I can give you that. I got here, and that's what I didn't know about making a Western, especially trying to make one here. In the 6 months I spent here, I experienced a year of life. I went from snow to sleet to not tornado warnings, but tornadoes. And there were days that we weren't allowed by the state of Texas, who was probably the #1 on our call sheet. Like Texas didn't want to shoot that, you know, today. Texas pushes you into a corner, and I think as an artist, you may just take a couple paces to the side and you see something else. So I think that's sort of where it lent itself to me.
When you're doing a show like this, the landscape becomes a character. So much depends on your location team, and the things that are offered up to you may be beautiful, but if it rains and you can't get there, you can't shoot that day. And you can't tell the story of the land unless you have people who are willing to get dirty and tired and wait out that 4-hour thunderstorm or stay up all night to shoot that scene in the morning because the location is so beautiful and you can't go back there.
So what do you, like, how does your production design, like your team, because the outside is the outside. You can control what you create in the inside, but you know, when you're choosing these places to shoot. I
remember a specific day, I think I told Chad about this, where we went looking for a tree. And we had been out at Bosque Ranch for weeks. I think at this point, Christina and I, that's the other part of this, right? When you watch this, the location is such a character that you will never see us take the foot off the gas pedal of like, let's make this little beat different. The terrain has to feel different. We have to feel like he has traveled. There was just that constant care about every frame. A piece of dirt was not just a piece of dirt on this show. It was very important.
Well, and of course, with a Western, that's a huge amount because there's so much that you have to worry about. How did they dress? How specific was it? Where did they live? You know, so in doing historical nonfiction, which is clearly the space you guys are in, I'd just like to hear from each of you. What's the one unexpected challenge of being in that space?
I would say on a personal and very emotional level, you know, and maybe this happened because I didn't understand all the history, but the history that I've been taught with, as far as this country goes, has been the history given to an immigrant, right? Moved here. And I've always, like I said, been given that version of there was a group of people and there was another group of people and then this one did this and some bad stuff happened and whatnot. So you learn history. When you go to work on history and the history ends up being so real, right? Like so true to the point. Everything that we've told you today, from our greens department to our production designers to the costuming to the writing to everything, right? This is all real. My job at that point is just to go in there and tell some camera operators where to be, what I'd like to see, what I hope to get out of the scene. The unexpected challenge was I didn't realize I would get so emotional. And I've shot a lot. I've shot tough scenes. I've shot things that I've never shown my children. You know, it's not appropriate. This is the first thing that I've been a part of in this town, you know, this Hollywood town, that I actually do want to show my children, because I think I also owe them the explanation of, man, this really moved your father. You know, I had to wait till I was 40-something years of age to say that. But like I finally learned this very important chapter of American history. Yeah, it was kind of touching because I think it becomes so real that you can't help but envision a former 150-year-old, sooner version of yourself. And you ask yourself, man, like, if it was me, what would I do? And sometimes I would ask myself because these scenes felt so real, and honestly, they would just get to me. We got through them because I had people to lean on, but it definitely moved me, and I hope it does the same for you all.
And like you said, what would I have done? What would David have done? And that is the only thing that connects us, you know, our sympathetic nervous systems to something that happened 200 years ago, 150 years ago, is by trying to draw on our own humanity to connect those pieces. And I think that was the most difficult part, is with a story this important, you are obviously compelled to do it the greatest justice that you are capable of. And in those places where you have to step off the path because the path ends, you need to trust your instincts and the instincts of your fellow creators to get you to that next stepping stone that you know is concrete.
I also didn't expect to get nearly as emotional as I did. I mean, I cried a number of times while we were filming, and you know, we shot on a plantation that's still standing in Nacogdoches, Texas, and we shoot this card game scene that y'all have heard so much about, and started crying because of the dark history of this country. And David came off set and was also crying. And to be able to embrace each other and comfort each other in that moment was just something I didn't expect.
I happened upon a 19-year-old young black man. I forgot where he was from. And before the interview ever really kicked off, he was just so excited to tell me, bro, you got me watching Westerns. We don't watch Westerns, bro. And I realized in that moment, I think maybe that's the why now, because why not, man?
We all came onto this project after, you know, David Oyelowo had been pushing for it for years. And I think why now is it's an incredible story of persistence. And it's something that I have to remind myself often, that the difference between being able to tell that story, getting to that place you wanted to be, making that movie, and not is a whole lot of not quitting. And I think if at any point in this process David had given up, we wouldn't be telling this story now.
You've been watching Inside the Making of Lawman Bass Reeves on Story. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project that also includes the On Story radio program, podcast, book series, and the On Story archive, accessible through the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com.